Wait, that song. Nobody in this world should know that melody. William Carter stopped mid-step in the glass-walled atrium of the Riverside Gala, the city lights of Chicago shimmering beyond the windows like distant stars. The sound that had frozen him wasn't loud. It was fragile, almost accidental, a child's voice drifting through the open space where guests were mingling over champagne and soft piano music. At first, no one else seemed to notice, but for William, it was as if the entire world had been muted in an instant. He stood still, his hand loosening its grip on the glass he had been holding, his breath caught somewhere between recognition and disbelief. Across the atrium, near a marble staircase lined with white orchids, a small girl stood alone. She couldn't have been older than 8. Her name tag, slightly crooked on her simple dress, read Ava Johnson. She wasn't performing for attention. She wasn't even looking at the crowd. She was just singing softly to herself, as if the song belonged only to her memory and the empty air around her. But William knew that melody. It wasn't just familiar, it was impossible, because that song had died 3 years ago with Emily Carter. His late wife had written it one winter evening in their old apartment on the west side of Chicago, when snow pressed gently against the windows and the world felt smaller, safer, temporary in a way that only love can make it feel. Emily had never recorded it, never shared it, never even named it publicly. It had been something she hummed only in private moments, when she thought no one was listening. And now, in the middle of a crowded gala filled with politicians, investors, and voices of influence, a little girl with worn shoes and a quiet presence was singing it word for word. William's pulse slowed, not from calm, but from shock so deep it felt like silence pressing against his chest. The room around him continued to move. Glasses clinked, laughter rose and fell, footsteps crossed polished floors, but all of it felt distant, like it belonged to another world he was no longer part of. His eyes stayed locked on Ava, tracing the gentle rise and fall of her voice, the way she seemed, unaware of the effect she was having. For a moment, he almost convinced himself it was coincidence, that grief was playing tricks on him again, reshaping ordinary things into ghosts. But then the second verse came, and his certainty collapsed. Emily used to sing that same verse while standing barefoot in their kitchen, stirring coffee she always forgot she had already made. William could see it so clearly now that it hurt in a way he had not expected anymore. The light above her head, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the quiet rhythm of a life that once felt infinite. No, he whispered under his breath, though he wasn't sure what he was denying. He stepped forward without realizing it, weaving through the guests who barely noticed him as he moved, his focus narrowing until only the girl remained in his field of vision. Ava's voice wavered slightly on a note, then steadied again, as if guided by something deeper than memory. William stopped a few feet away from her, close enough now to see the faint nervousness in her expression, but also the strange calm in her posture. She wasn't performing for approval. She wasn't afraid of judgment. She was simply existing inside the song, as if it had always been part of her. "Where did you hear that?" William asked, his voice lower than he intended, almost breaking on the last word. Ava looked up at him briefly, surprised but not frightened, then shrugged as if the answer was simple. "I don't know, sir," she said softly, her eyes drifting away for a moment as if she were searching inside herself. "I just remember it." That answer should not have meant anything. It should have been meaningless, childish, uncertain. But instead, it struck William harder than anything he had heard in years. Because remembering was not the same as learning, and this song was not something the world was supposed to remember. His mind began to fracture between logic and something far more unsettling. He thought of Emily again, of the way she used to hum, without realizing she was doing it, of how she once said some melodies feel like they don't belong to just one life. At the time, he had smiled at that idea, dismissing it as her poetic way of seeing things. Now it felt like a sentence he had never understood until it was too late. Ava continued to stand there quietly, unaware that her voice had pulled a man out of the present and dragged him into a past he had buried so deep it had almost stopped existing. William looked at her more closely now, at the small details he had missed in his shock, the careful way she held herself, the quiet resilience in her stillness, the sense that she was used to being unseen. The atrium lights reflected faintly in her eyes, and for a brief moment, William felt something shift inside him, something he had not felt since the day Emily was gone. Not pain exactly, but the unbearable return of something he had learned to live without. And then Ava began to sing the next line again, softer this time, almost like a whisper meant only for herself, and William Carter realized with absolute certainty that whatever had brought this moment into his life, it was not coincidence at all. William Carter did not move for several seconds after the last note faded. It was as if the world had carefully placed him back into motion while forgetting to restart something essential inside him. The chatter of the gala returned gradually, like a wave pulling itself back onto shore, but none of it reached him in any meaningful way. He kept his eyes fixed on the small girl near the staircase, watching her lower her gaze as if unsure whether she had done something wrong by simply existing in that moment. Ava Johnson shifted slightly on her feet, her fingers lightly gripping the edge of her simple dress, her expression calm but cautious, like a child who had grown used to not being noticed. William finally exhaled, but it felt uneven, controlled only by effort. He told himself there had to be an explanation, a rational one, something that did not belong to memory or ghosts or the impossible weight of grief reshaping reality. He stepped closer again, slowly this time, as if sudden movement might break whatever fragile balance was holding the moment together. Around them, guests continued to talk, unaware that something had just fractured quietly in the center of the room. William stopped at a respectful distance, lowering himself slightly so he was closer to her height, though his presence still carried the unconscious weight of authority and confusion. "Where did you hear that song?" he asked again, more carefully now, his voice steadier but carrying an edge that betrayed how unsettled he was. Ava looked at him for a moment, then glanced away toward the marble floor as if searching for words that did not fully belong to language. "I do not really know, sir," she said softly. "It is just in my head sometimes. Like I already heard it before, a long time ago." William felt a tightness rise in his chest, not pain exactly, but recognition fighting against denial. That answer should have made it easier, should have closed the door on uncertainty, but instead it opened something wider. He studied her more closely now, noticing the faint tiredness in her eyes, the quiet composure that came from a life that had not been easy, and yet there was no performance in her voice, no attempt to impress or manipulate. She was simply telling the truth as she understood it. Still, truth was not enough to explain what he had just heard. Emily Carter had written that song in private, never recorded, never shared beyond the walls of their home. William remembered her once laughing softly while humming it, saying that some melodies feel like they belong to people who are not even born yet. He had thought it was just one of her poetic ideas, something beautiful but detached from reality. Now that memory felt heavier than it should have. Ava shifted again and added quietly, almost as if she felt the need to clarify, "My mom used to hum something like it too, I think. When she was cleaning or cooking. I did not think about it before, but when I started singing, it just came out the same way." William's eyes sharpened slightly at the mention of her mother. It was another thread, another fragile piece of logic trying to anchor itself in explanation. Still, it did not fit. The melody was too precise, too identical, not just in notes but in timing, in pauses, in the way the emotion carried through the silence between phrases. He straightened slightly, running a hand once over the edge of his suit jacket as if grounding himself in something physical. Around them, a few guests had started to notice the interaction, though most still assumed it was nothing more than a brief exchange between a guest and a child performing or wandering through the event space. William ignored them. His attention remained fixed entirely on Ava. "Can you sing it again?" he asked before he fully thought about the request. Ava hesitated, her eyes flicking briefly toward the crowd, then back to him. There was uncertainty there now, not fear, but awareness that something about this moment carried weight she did not fully understand. Still, after a short pause, she nodded. When she began again, it was softer this time, more fragile, as if she were no longer sure she should be singing at all. The melody filled the space again, but this time William was not frozen by shock alone. He was listening differently, dissecting each note, each breath, each transition that mirrored something carved into his memory so deeply it had become part of him. His mind began to push back harder now, searching for alternatives, coincidences, forgotten influences, anything that could break the impossible symmetry forming in front of him. But nothing broke it. Instead, it grew clearer. Ava reached a quiet pause in the song and stopped, looking at him as if waiting for approval she did not expect to receive. William realized his hands had gone still at his sides, tense without his awareness. He forced himself to speak again, though his voice was lower now, less controlled. "That song," he said slowly. "It is very important to me." Ava nodded slightly, not fully understanding. "It feels important," she replied simply. That single sentence landed harder than anything else. Not because it provided answers, but because it did not. William stepped back half a pace, as if distance might help him think more clearly. But clarity was no longer available. Only contradiction remained. He looked at Ava again, at the child standing in the middle of a world she did not seem to realize she had disrupted, and for the first time since Emily's death, William Carter felt the uncomfortable possibility that something he believed was gone might not have disappeared in the way he had always assumed. William Carter stood still as Ava Johnson finished her last words, and for a moment he felt something he had not allowed himself to feel in years, a fragile sense of possibility fighting against the weight of logic. The gala continued around them, glasses clinking softly, distant laughter rising and falling like waves that no longer reached him. But his world had narrowed to the small space between himself and the child standing in front of him. Ava looked down again, shifting slightly as if unsure whether she should remain or step away, her hands loosely clasped in front of her. William noticed the subtle change in her posture, the way she seemed to retreat inward whenever attention lingered too long, and something about it unsettled him in a way he could not immediately explain. He straightened slowly, forcing his mind to move beyond emotion and into clarity, though both kept interfering with each other. "You said your mother hums that melody," he said carefully, keeping his tone steady. "What is her name?" Ava hesitated, then answered quietly. "Her name is Linda Johnson." The name meant nothing at first, just another thread in a city full of names, but William still felt compelled to repeat it internally, as if it might connect to something hidden. He searched his memory for any association, any trace, but there was none. Still, the way Ava said it carried a familiarity that made him uneasy, not because of recognition, but because of certainty in her voice. "Does your mother work near here?" he asked after a pause, his voice softer now. Ava nodded slightly. "She cleans offices downtown sometimes. She used to work in a building near the river, I think. She said it was a place with music inside sometimes, like people practicing instruments." William felt a faint tightening in his chest at the mention of music in a professional building, because Emily had once recorded her private compositions in a small studio space located in a building overlooking the river, a detail so specific that it had never been shared publicly. He told himself again that coincidence was still the most reasonable explanation, yet his thoughts were no longer cooperating with certainty. Ava shifted her weight and looked up at him briefly, as if gauging whether she had said too much. "I only sang it because it makes me feel calm," she added softly. "My mom says some songs feel like they belong to people even before they meet them." That sentence struck William harder than anything else that evening because it echoed something Emily had once said almost word for word during a quiet night years ago, when they had been sitting together on the floor of their apartment, surrounded by half-finished ideas and forgotten cups of coffee. He remembered laughing at the time, calling it one of her philosophical moods, but now it returned with unsettling precision. William took a slow step back, his eyes briefly scanning the room not for people but for anchors, anything that could re-establish the boundary between memory and reality. Instead, his attention returned again and again to Ava, as if drawn against his will. "Can you show me where you live?" he asked finally, surprising even himself with the question. Ava blinked, clearly uncertain. "It is not far," she said after a moment. "My mom will be waiting, though. She does not like when I stay out too long." William nodded slightly, processing the implication, and then made a decision that felt less like choice and more like necessity. He gestured gently toward the side exit of the gala hall, away from the main crowd. "I would like to speak with her," he said. Ava studied him for a brief moment, then gave a small nod. As they moved through the edge of the event space, William became aware of how strange they must have looked, a billionaire in a tailored suit walking beside a child in a simple dress, but the thought barely registered compared to the internal dissonance building inside him. The night air outside was cooler, carrying the faint hum of traffic and distant city life. And for the first time since hearing the song, William felt the world expand again beyond a single frozen moment. Ava led him a short distance down the sidewalk, turning toward a quieter street lined with modest buildings and dim streetlights. They stopped near a small residential entrance where the glow from a window suggested life inside. Ava turned to him and pointed gently. "That is my home," she said. William looked at the building, then at the window, and then back at the child, feeling something shift again, something less like shock and more like anticipation of truth. Before he could respond, the door opened slightly, and a woman appeared, her expression alert and cautious as she looked out toward the street. Ava immediately brightened. "Mom," she called softly. The woman stepped out fully now, her eyes moving from her daughter to William, assessing the situation with quiet concern. William Carter stood still, suddenly aware that whatever explanation existed, it was no longer abstract or distant. It was standing directly in front of him, ready to either confirm or completely reshape everything he believed he had lost. The woman standing at the doorway studied William Carter in silence for a long moment, her posture steady but cautious, as if she was trying to decide whether this unexpected visitor belonged to a safe category or a dangerous one. Ava Johnson stood slightly behind her mother, peeking out with quiet curiosity, her earlier confidence replaced by the softer awareness children often carry when adults shift into serious conversation. William remained still, aware of the weight of the moment pressing into the narrow space between them. The sound of distant traffic filled the street, but it felt muted, as if the world itself was waiting for an explanation. Finally, the woman spoke. "Ava, go inside," she said gently, without taking her eyes off William. Ava hesitated for only a second before obeying, stepping back into the building, leaving the two adults alone under the dim glow of the porch light. The woman then crossed her arms lightly, not in hostility, but in controlled caution. "I am Linda Johnson," she said carefully. "My daughter said you were asking questions about a song." William nodded once, trying to steady his thoughts. "Yes," he replied. "I heard her singing something earlier tonight. It is a melody I recognize very clearly." Linda's expression shifted subtly, not toward surprise, but toward something more complex, something closer to recognition mixed with concern. "My daughter likes to make up songs sometimes," she said slowly, though her voice carried a thin uncertainty. William did not respond immediately. He was watching her closely now, not searching for deception, but for alignment between memory and reality. "This was not made up," he said quietly. "That melody was written by someone very close to me." The words hung in the air between them, carrying a weight neither of them fully wanted to acknowledge yet. Linda looked down briefly, then back at him. "Sir, I do not know what you think you heard, but Ava is just a child. She hears things, she repeats them, sometimes she blends them together." William exhaled slowly, forcing patience into his tone. "The song she sang was not something commonly known," he said. "It was never released. It was never recorded publicly. It belonged to my late wife." That statement changed the atmosphere immediately. Linda's expression tightened slightly, not in anger, but in sudden alertness, as if a private boundary had been crossed without intention. "I am sorry for your loss," she said more softly. William nodded once, acknowledging the sentiment, but his focus remained unbroken. "What I am trying to understand," he continued, "is how your daughter knows it." There was a pause, the kind of pause that carries more meaning than words. Linda looked past him for a moment, toward the street, as if gathering thoughts that had not been spoken aloud in a long time. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter. "Ava's father left when she was very young," she said. "It has just been the two of us for most of her life. I used to work cleaning offices downtown, sometimes late at night. She would come with me when I could not find childcare." William listened without interrupting, but something in the pattern she described began to tighten the invisible threads in his mind. Downtown offices, late hours, buildings with private floors and restricted access. He tried to remain objective, but the coincidences were becoming harder to dismiss. Linda continued, her tone steady but reflective. "There was one building where I worked for a few months," she said. "It had a small music studio on one of the upper floors. Sometimes I would hear someone practicing or recording late in the evening when I was cleaning nearby offices. Ava would sit quietly and listen if we were still there. She has always been drawn to music. William's breath slowed. The detail about a studio was precise in a way that felt uncomfortably aligned with memory. He had not thought about that building in years, not since Emily used to spend long evenings there experimenting with melodies she never intended to share. He remembered waiting for her downstairs, sending messages she sometimes did not answer until she came out hours later, smiling like she had been somewhere beyond time. Linda watched his reaction carefully now, noticing the shift in his expression. "Is something wrong?" she asked. William shook his head slightly, though the movement felt automatic rather than certain. "No," he said. "It is just unexpected." Ava reappeared at the door behind her mother, half hidden but clearly listening now. Her presence reminded William of how small she was in comparison to the magnitude of what was unfolding, yet somehow central to it all. He looked at her again, and for the first time, the possibility that this was not coincidence began to take shape not as imagination, but as something he could no longer fully reject. "Ava," he said gently, "can you remember anything about where you first heard that song?" The girl hesitated, then stepped forward slightly, looking between her mother and William before answering. "I do not remember a place," she said honestly. "I just remember hearing it when I was very little. It makes me feel like I have heard it before I can even remember things clearly." William felt something tighten in his chest again, but this time it was not confusion alone. It was the faint outline of recognition trying to become understanding. Linda placed a light hand on her daughter's shoulder, as if grounding her in the moment, but her eyes remained on William. "I do not know what connection you believe this song has," she said carefully, "but I can tell you that Ava has never met anyone connected to your family." William absorbed the statement, but instead of relief, what he felt was an even deeper pull toward unanswered questions. The melody, the building, the timing, the way Ava sang without learning it formally, everything was aligning too precisely to ignore. He looked back toward the quiet street, then at the doorway where Ava stood, and finally at Linda, realizing that whatever truth was buried beneath this, it was closer than he had ever expected to find again. The silence outside the small residential entrance lingered longer than any of them expected, stretching between William Carter, Linda Johnson, and the faint glow spilling from the hallway behind them. Ava Johnson stood just inside the doorway now, half hidden but fully attentive, her presence quiet yet steady, as if she understood that something important was unfolding even if she could not define it. William remained still on the sidewalk, his thoughts no longer moving in straight lines, but circling back through fragments of memory that refused to settle. The melody, the building, the mention of a late-night studio, everything was beginning to overlap in a way that made coincidence feel increasingly fragile. Linda adjusted her posture slightly, her caution still present, but now mixed with something closer to curiosity. "I do not think this conversation is appropriate to continue outside," she said calmly, glancing briefly toward the dim street. William nodded once, acknowledging the point, though his mind was elsewhere, still anchored to the voice of a child singing a song that should not have existed in her world. After a brief pause, Linda stepped aside just enough to allow the entrance to remain open without fully inviting him in. It was a subtle gesture, not trust, but not rejection either. "If you have questions," she added carefully, "you can speak with me for a few minutes. But I need to make sure my daughter is comfortable." William understood immediately. He offered a slight nod of respect. "Of course," he said. Ava lingered at the threshold for a moment longer, her eyes flicking between the two adults, then slowly moved back inside, as if drawn by the familiar safety of her home. William's gaze followed her briefly before returning to Linda. The two of them stood in a quiet tension shaped not by hostility, but by uncertainty. Linda gestured toward a small seating area just inside the entrance hallway, modest but clean, with a narrow bench and a small table holding a few everyday items. William stepped inside without hesitation, though the environment felt distant from his usual world of polished offices and high-rise glass. The door remained partially open behind them, allowing the sound of the city to drift faintly into the space. Once seated, Linda studied him more openly now. "I need to understand why this matters so much to you," she said. William took a slow breath, choosing his words with unusual care. Because the song your daughter sang is not just a melody, he replied. It is something my wife created privately. It was part of her life that very few people ever heard. She never published it, never recorded it, never shared it beyond our home and a single studio she occasionally used. Linda listened without interrupting, her expression growing more serious with each detail. William continued, his voice steady but layered with restrained emotion. My wife passed away 3 years ago, he said. Since then, I have not heard that song in any form, anywhere. And tonight, I heard it through your daughter. There was a long pause after he finished speaking. The weight of his words seemed to settle into the space between them, altering the atmosphere in ways none of them could ignore. Ava, standing quietly near the hallway corner, listened without speaking, her small hands resting lightly against the wall, as if she was unsure whether she should step forward or remain still. Linda finally exhaled softly, absorbing the information. I am sorry for your loss, she said again, more personally this time. Then she added, but I still do not understand how Ava could know something so specific. William leaned slightly forward, his focus sharpening. You mentioned a building downtown where you worked, he said. Do you remember the name? Linda hesitated for a moment, then nodded slowly. It was the Harrington River Center, she said. William felt a subtle shift in his chest as soon as she said it. The name was not just familiar, it was directly tied to the years when Emily had worked on her private compositions. That building had once contained a small creative studio space on its upper floors, a place William had visited only a handful of times, but remembered vividly because Emily had described it as her quiet escape from the world. He did not react outwardly, but something inside him tightened with recognition. That is where she worked, William said quietly, more to himself than to them. Ava, hearing the name, stepped slightly forward from the hallway. I remember going there sometimes, she said softly, surprising both adults. Linda turned toward her immediately. You were very small then, she said gently. Ava nodded. I used to sit in a room with music sometimes while you were working. I do not remember everything, but I remember the sound. It was pretty. William looked at her carefully now, and for the first time, he began to see not just coincidence, but continuity. The possibility that what he thought was lost might have left traces in places he had never considered. Do you remember anyone who might have been there with you? He asked Ava gently. The girl thought for a moment, then shook her head slightly. Only my mom, she said. And sometimes a woman who played piano when no one else was around. Linda's expression shifted subtly at that detail, as if she was trying to reconcile memory with forgotten fragments of routine. William felt the air in the room grow heavier, not with tension, but with the slow emergence of something long buried. He stood slowly, walking a few steps toward the small window beside the hallway. Outside, the city continued its distant rhythm, unaware of the quiet unraveling happening inside a modest apartment entrance. For a brief moment, William Carter felt something unfamiliar return, not certainty, but direction. He turned back toward Ava and Linda, his voice lower now, but steadier than before. I would like to hear her sing it again, he said softly. Ava looked up at her mother first, then back at William, and after a moment of silent consideration, she gave a small, uncertain nod. The small hallway of the residential entrance fell into a deeper kind of silence after Ava Johnson gave her quiet nod, a silence that felt less like absence of sound and more like anticipation of something inevitable. William Carter remained standing near the narrow window, though his attention was no longer on the city outside. It was entirely focused on the child in front of him, as if the rest of the world had softened into background noise. Linda Johnson watched carefully, her posture steady but her expression more uncertain now, as though she was beginning to sense that this moment carried meaning beyond a simple misunderstanding. Ava stepped forward slowly from the hallway corner into the small open space between the bench and the door, her movements careful and unhurried. For a brief moment, she looked at her mother again, and Linda gave a subtle, reassuring nod. William said nothing. He did not want to interrupt whatever fragile thread was forming. Ava took a small breath, almost like she was gathering something invisible from the air around her, and then she began to sing again. The first note was soft, barely more than a whisper of sound, but it carried immediately through the small space with an emotional clarity that made William's chest tighten. As the melody unfolded, it was no longer just a repetition of something familiar. It was something deeper, layered with nuance that he had not fully noticed before. The rhythm, the pauses, the subtle rise and fall of tone, all of it aligned with a memory so precise that it felt less like recollection and more like reliving. William closed his eyes without realizing it, and in that instant the hallway around him seemed to dissolve. He was no longer standing in a modest apartment entrance in present-day Chicago. He was somewhere else entirely, somewhere warm and quiet, where light filtered through half-closed curtains and the faint scent of coffee lingered in the air. Emily Carter was there in his mind, standing near a small, upright piano in their old apartment, her voice blending with the same melody Ava was now singing. William's breathing slowed as the memory sharpened. He could see Emily clearly now, her expression calm and distant in the way it always became when she was lost inside music. She had once told him that songs do not belong to people, they pass through them, and he remembered laughing softly at that idea, never fully understanding it until now. When Ava reached the second verse, William opened his eyes again, and the present returned with sudden intensity. The hallway was still small, the light still dim, but everything felt altered by what he had just experienced. Ava's voice continued steadily, unaffected by his reaction, as if she was simply following something that had always been inside her. Linda stood slightly behind her daughter now, watching William more closely than before, noticing the change in his expression. There was no longer confusion in his face, only something deeper, something closer to realization struggling to take shape. William took a slow step forward, then another, until he was closer to Ava than before, though he still maintained a respectful distance. His eyes remained fixed on her, as if searching for something just beneath what he could see. When Ava reached the final part of the melody, her voice softened even further, carrying a fragile stillness that seemed to hold the entire room in place. And then it stopped. The silence that followed was immediate and complete, as if the world itself had paused to let the moment settle. Ava lowered her gaze slightly, unsure of what would come next. William did not speak right away. His mind was moving too quickly, assembling fragments that had not been connected before. The melody was not only identical to Emily's composition, it carried the same emotional timing, the same intentional imperfections that Emily used to describe as human texture. No formal recording could replicate that. No accidental repetition could preserve it so precisely. Linda finally broke the silence gently. "She does that sometimes," she said quietly, looking between William and her daughter. "She remembers things in pieces, like fragments of sounds or moments she cannot fully explain." William turned slightly toward Linda, but his voice, when it came, was directed more toward the realization forming in his own mind than toward her. "That is not possible," he said softly, though there was no firmness left in the words. This was not something that could be remembered accidentally. Ava looked up at him again, sensing the shift in his tone, though she did not appear afraid. Only curious. "Did I do something wrong?" she asked quietly. The question immediately grounded William, pulling him out of the spiral of memory. He shook his head slightly. "No," he said at once. "You did nothing wrong." His voice softened further as he continued. "You sang something very important to me." Ava nodded slowly, accepting the answer without fully understanding it. Linda stepped forward slightly now, placing a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder, both protective and grounding. "I told you she likes music," Linda said carefully, though her voice lacked its earlier certainty. William looked at her now, fully present. "This is not just liking music," he replied. "This is exact recall of something deeply personal that was never shared outside of private space." There was a pause again, heavier this time, filled with the weight of implications neither of them fully wanted to name yet. Ava shifted slightly closer to her mother, sensing the seriousness without understanding its source. William looked down briefly, his thoughts now no longer searching for coincidence, but for structure. A pattern was forming, one that suggested proximity rather than chance, connection rather than randomness. He raised his eyes again slowly. "You said you worked in a building downtown," he said to Linda. "The Harrington River Center." Linda nodded cautiously. "Yes." William exhaled slowly, as if confirming something he had not yet fully accepted. "My wife spent a significant amount of time there," he said quietly, "in a private studio on the upper floors." The words landed differently this time, not as information, but as alignment. Ava looked between them again, sensing a shift she could not define. Linda's expression changed subtly, as if something long forgotten was beginning to surface beneath routine memory. William remained still, his voice lowering. Even further, if she was there, he said, then it is possible they were in the same place more often than I ever knew. The hallway seemed to narrow in perception, not physically but emotionally, as the boundaries between past and present, between strangers and shared history, began to blur. Ava stood quietly between them, unaware that her voice had become the bridge between two lives that were never supposed to intersect again, while William Carter, for the first time since losing Emily, felt not certainty, but the beginning of truth moving closer than grief had ever allowed it before. The hallway felt different now, as if the air itself had become thinner after the last note of Ava Johnson's song faded into silence. William Carter remained still for a long moment, his attention no longer on the present surroundings, but on the invisible thread that seemed to connect everything he had just witnessed. Linda Johnson stood beside her daughter, her expression quieter now, no longer defensive but contemplative, as if the structure of what she believed to be ordinary life had begun to shift in small but undeniable ways. Ava, sensing the change in atmosphere, moved closer to her mother, her small hand lightly holding onto the fabric of Linda's sleeve. William finally exhaled, slowly and deliberately, as though grounding himself back into the physical space around him. I need to understand something, he said softly, his voice no longer carrying the hesitation it had before, but instead a steady urgency shaped by realization. Linda looked at him without speaking, waiting. William continued, choosing his words with care. You said your daughter remembers hearing music in the Harrington River Center. You said there was a studio there where she sometimes listened while you worked. Linda nodded slightly. Yes, but it was not anything unusual, just background sound. I never thought much of it. William's gaze shifted briefly toward Ava, who was watching him quietly now, her expression open and innocent, unaware of the magnitude of what she might be carrying. That studio, he said, turning back to Linda, belonged to my wife. A silence followed immediately, deeper than the previous ones, not heavy with tension but with recognition trying to surface without form. Linda's expression changed subtly, her eyes narrowing slightly as she processed the implication. Your wife, she repeated slowly. William nodded. Emily Carter. The name seemed to settle into the room like something fragile yet undeniable. Ava tilted her head slightly, as if the name itself stirred something faint in her memory, though she could not place it. Linda, however, remained still, her thoughts clearly moving in directions she had not expected when this conversation began. I did not know her name, Linda said carefully, but I remember a woman who stayed late sometimes. She would sit in that studio alone. Ava and I would wait in the nearby office area until I finished cleaning. Sometimes she would smile at Ava when she walked by. William listened intently, his internal composure beginning to fracture not from shock, but from accumulation. Each detail added weight to something that was no longer theoretical. Ava shifted slightly, looking between the adults again. She was kind, Ava said softly, almost as if remembering something distant and indistinct. She used to hum sometimes when she thought no one was listening. William felt his chest tighten at those words, not because they were new, but because they aligned too precisely with who Emily had been in private moments. He took a slow step forward, stopping just short of the bench inside the small hallway. That humming, he said quietly, was part of the song you just sang. Ava looked up at him again, her expression thoughtful but unburdened by the complexity of the realization forming around her. I think she liked it, Ava said simply. Linda placed a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder, as if anchoring her to the present while also trying to steady her own thoughts. William, she said carefully, using his name now for the first time, I understand this is difficult, but you are suggesting something very specific. William met her gaze directly. I am not suggesting anything, he replied softly. I am recognizing it. The distinction lingered between them. Outside, a distant car passed, its headlights briefly illuminating the hallway before fading again, leaving them in a softer, more intimate light. William lowered his gaze briefly, gathering his thoughts, then looked back at Ava. How often did you hear her? He asked gently. Ava thought for a moment. Not every day, she said. Sometimes just when we were there late. She would be alone in the room, and I could hear her through the door or when she walked past. William nodded slowly, absorbing the timeline, the proximity, the quiet intersections of lives that had never formally met but had clearly overlapped in ways he had never imagined. Linda exhaled softly, her posture easing slightly as understanding began to replace uncertainty. I never spoke to her, she added quietly. I did not even know her last name. She was just someone who worked in the building sometimes. William turned slightly, looking toward the narrow hallway as if he could reconstruct the space she was describing. In his mind, he saw fragments of that building again, the upper floors, the restricted studio space, the quiet hours where Emily would disappear into sound and return changed by it. He had never thought those moments extended beyond his awareness. Now, for the first time, he was forced to consider that they might have. Ava tugged gently on her mother's sleeve, breaking the intensity of the adult's focus. Is something wrong? She asked softly. Linda looked down at her daughter, then back at William. No, she said gently. Nothing is wrong. But her voice carried a subtle shift, as if the definition of wrong had become too simple for what they were beginning to uncover. William stepped back slightly, running a hand slowly through his hair, his thoughts no longer resisting the conclusion forming inside him. The melody, the building, the timing, the presence of a child who carried fragments of something deeply personal, all of it was aligning into a shape he could no longer dismiss as coincidence. He looked at Ava again, and for a moment, his expression softened in a way that had not appeared since Emily's passing. I think, he said quietly, almost to himself, that this song may not belong only to memory. Ava tilted her head slightly, not fully understanding, but sensing the emotional weight in his voice. Linda remained silent now, watching William carefully as if she too understood that whatever came next would not simply be explanation, but revelation. And in that quiet hallway, between past and present, between loss and something unexplainably returning, William Carter felt the first undeniable pull toward a truth he had not been prepared to find again. The hallway remained still after William Carter's last words, as if even the air itself was waiting for what he would say next. Linda Johnson stood quietly beside her daughter, her expression no longer purely cautious, but now layered with something closer to uncertainty mixed with dawning awareness. Ava Johnson, sensing the shift in the emotional atmosphere, remained close to her mother but occasionally glanced at William with a quiet curiosity that children often carry when they realize adults are grappling with something beyond their understanding. William exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting for a moment toward the narrow window beside the hallway, though his attention was not on the city outside. It was on everything he had just heard, everything he had just felt, and everything that was no longer possible to dismiss as coincidence. There is something else, he said quietly, his voice steady but lower than before. Linda looked at him without speaking, waiting. William turned back toward Ava. When you sing that melody, there is a part near the end where the rhythm shifts slightly, almost like it hesitates before continuing. Ava blinked, then nodded slightly. Yes, she said softly. It feels like it slows down there. William felt a subtle tightening in his chest, not from confusion anymore, but from recognition becoming sharper. That hesitation, he said carefully, was something my wife used to call breathing space. She said it was where emotion had to catch up with sound. Linda's expression shifted immediately at that detail. It was small, precise, and far too specific to be random. She looked briefly at her daughter, then back at William. You are saying she learned this from your wife? She said slowly. Not as a question, but as an attempt to understand the implication forming in front of her. William did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked at Ava again. Did anyone ever teach you that part of the song? He asked gently. Ava shook her head. No, she said. It just happens when I sing it. It feels like it is supposed to slow down there. A silence followed, deeper than the ones before, not heavy but profoundly still. William lowered his gaze briefly, as if trying to organize thoughts that no longer fit into any logical structure he had relied on for years. Then, almost quietly to himself, he said, Emily used to say that exact phrase. Linda's eyes softened slightly at the mention of the name again, but she remained silent, allowing him to continue. William stepped a little closer now, not toward confrontation, but toward understanding. There is something I need to confirm, he said. Not for argument. For clarity, he paused briefly, then looked directly at Ava. When you sing it, do you feel like you are remembering it, or like it is already inside you before you start? Ava thought for a moment, her small face thoughtful in a way that carried more depth than her age suggested. It is already there, she said finally. I do not have to look for it. It just comes when I feel quiet. William closed his eyes briefly at that answer, not in disbelief, but in the overwhelming weight of alignment. Every detail, every fragment, every explanation that had been offered so far was no longer separate. It was converging into something singular and undeniable. When he opened his eyes again, his voice had changed slightly, softer now, almost restrained. My wife used to say the same thing about music, he said, that some melodies do not begin when you start singing them. They begin long before you realize you are hearing them. Linda shifted slightly, her arms loosening at her sides as if her earlier guardedness was giving way to a more reflective state. I never knew her, she said quietly, but I remember that woman in the studio. She would sometimes stop everything and just sit at the piano for a long time without playing, like she was listening to something no one else could hear. William felt a wave of recognition pass through him again, stronger this time, not just emotional, but almost structural, as if pieces of a hidden architecture were finally aligning. Ava looked between the two adults, sensing that the conversation had moved into a place where she was no longer just a participant in song, but something closer to its origin point. I want to hear it again, William said suddenly, though his voice carried no urgency now, only a quiet need for confirmation. Ava nodded slowly and took a small breath. Linda did not stop her. This time, the song began differently. Not louder, not clearer, but deeper, as if Ava was no longer simply reproducing it, but allowing it to unfold through her without resistance. William listened without moving. Every note now felt familiar in a way that was no longer theoretical. It was lived, it was remembered, and it was impossible to separate from Emily's presence in his memory. As Ava reached the central passage of the melody, William's expression shifted subtly. His breathing slowed. His shoulders eased slightly, not from relief, but from surrendering resistance to something he could no longer fight with logic alone. There was a moment, brief but unmistakable, where the sound, the memory, and the present seemed to occupy the same space. When the song ended, the silence returned gently, not abruptly. Ava lowered her gaze again, as if unsure whether she had done something meaningful or simply repeated what she always did. William remained still for several seconds. Then he spoke, his voice quieter than before. That is not just memory, he said. Linda looked at him carefully. Then what is it? She asked softly. William did not answer immediately. He looked at Ava, then at Linda, and finally toward the hallway, as if the answer existed somewhere just beyond what could be seen. It is connection, he said at last. Something that did not end when I thought it did. And in that moment, standing in a small residential hallway far from the world he knew, William Carter felt the first unmistakable shift from grief towards something he had not allowed himself to consider in years. The possibility that what he had lost might not have vanished completely, but had instead continued in a form he had never expected to find again. The silence that followed Ava Johnson's final note did not feel empty, but complete, as if the space inside the small hallway had finally reached a point where every unanswered question had gathered and settled into something heavier than words. William Carter remained still, his eyes fixed not on any one person but on the invisible space between them, where meaning had been forming slowly since the moment he first heard the song. Linda Johnson stood beside her daughter, her posture no longer guarded, but no longer fully relaxed either, as though she now understood that the conversation they were having had moved beyond coincidence and into something far more personal. Ava looked up briefly at William, her expression calm but slightly uncertain, as if she was sensing that the adults around her were standing at the edge of a realization she could not yet fully understand. William finally spoke, his voice quiet but steady, carrying the weight of someone who had stopped resisting what he was beginning to accept. I think I understand now, he said slowly. Linda did not respond immediately, waiting for him to continue. William took a breath, then continued. It is not just that she learned the melody. It is not just that she heard it in a building or from someone nearby. It is that the song itself carries something that was never meant to end. Ava tilted her head slightly, listening without interrupting, her small hands resting together in front of her. William looked at her more directly now, and his voice softened further. When my wife wrote that song, she used to say that music does not belong to the person who creates it. She said it travels, even when people do not realize it is moving. Linda's eyes lowered slightly at that, as if the words were reaching something in her memory she had not touched in a long time. William continued, his tone now more reflective than analytical. I did not understand what she meant at the time. I thought she was speaking about emotion, but now I think she meant something more literal than that. Ava listened quietly, her gaze steady but gentle. William looked at her again, and for a moment his expression softened in a way that had not been present since the beginning of this encounter. You did not learn that song, he said to her softly. You carried it. Ava did not respond immediately, but she did not reject the idea either. Instead, she simply stood there, as if the words settled around her without needing explanation. Linda shifted slightly, her voice quieter now. William, she said carefully, what exactly are you saying? He paused, then answered with a calm certainty that surprised even himself. I am saying that what I heard tonight is not an accident of memory or coincidence of exposure. It is something that continued beyond the moment it was created. And somehow, through circumstances I do not yet fully understand, it found its way into your daughter's life. A long silence followed, not uncomfortable, but deeply reflective. Ava looked between the two adults again, sensing that something important had been decided without her needing to fully grasp it. Linda exhaled slowly, her shoulders easing slightly, as if the weight of uncertainty had shifted into something more manageable, even if not fully explained. I do not know what that means for you, she said honestly, but I know my daughter. She does not make things up like this. If she sings something, it is because she feels it is already part of her. William nodded slowly at that, as if acknowledging a truth he had already begun to accept. He stepped back slightly, creating a small physical distance that allowed him to think more clearly. His mind was no longer searching for contradiction. It was now trying to understand continuity. He looked at Ava again, and this time his voice carried something softer, almost careful. Would you sing it one more time? He asked. Ava hesitated only briefly before nodding. Linda placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, not stopping her, but grounding her. Ava took a small breath and began again. The melody emerged softly at first, then steadied, filling the narrow space of the hallway once more. But this time, William did not react with shock or disbelief. He listened differently. He listened as someone who was no longer trying to prove whether something was real, but instead trying to understand what it meant that it was still here. Each note felt like a bridge between moments he had believed were permanently separated. Emily's presence in his memory no longer felt distant or locked in the past. It felt threaded through the present in ways he had never considered possible. When Ava reached the final phrase, her voice softened, then faded gently into silence. She lowered her gaze again, as if returning from somewhere she did not fully understand. William remained still for several seconds. Then he spoke, his voice quiet but deeply certain. This is not something I can explain away anymore, he said. Linda looked at him, waiting. William continued, I do not know exactly how or why this connection exists, but I know it is real, and I know it matters. He paused briefly, then added with careful clarity, I would like to understand it, not from a distance, but properly, if you are willing. Linda studied him for a moment, her expression thoughtful rather than defensive now. Finally, she gave a small, slow nod. We can talk, she said softly. Ava looked up at her mother, then at William, sensing that something had shifted but not feeling afraid of it. William looked at both of them, and for the first time since the beginning of the night, his expression carried something beyond grief or confusion. It carried presence, not resolution, but the beginning of acceptance that what he had lost had not simply vanished, but had somehow continued in a form he was only now beginning to recognize.